Welcome to Atlanta. This is my hometown. I was born and raised in Stone Mountain, Georgia, so I hope you guys get some good Southern hospitality while you're here. Okay, I want to just start with having everyone imagine a scenario. Okay, it's your call day. You're already in the hospital. You just started a new study the day before. It was just activated. Patient presents to your emergency room. Perfect candidate for your new study. Meets the criteria. He's a functionally independent patient. He was found down in Home Depot. They were able to find some phone numbers for an adult daughter and for the patient's wife. So they tried the wife first. Wife didn't answer the phone. So they contacted the daughter. The daughter answered the phone, sounded like she was at a ball field. And she got to a place where she could talk, and you're having to tell her then, okay, your father's had a stroke. We have a study that he would qualify for, that we think he'd be a good candidate for. And you're explaining all this to her, and as a lot of people do when they're nervous, she's freaking out going, you've got to call my mother, you've got to call my mother. She's out of town on a girls' trip, a well-needed girls' trip. My father just retired, and he's like, okay, we need to get back to it, ma'am. So while you're talking to the daughter, the patient's wife calls. You just go through the whole explanation with her. She wants to be in the study, wants her husband to be in the study, but she's at the beach. She's 6 hours away. So you have a patient that completely qualifies for your study, but you can't get written informed consent. What are you going to do? I hope nobody says they're going to get verbal consent, because that would be very, very bad. So we had this situation come up over and over and over, and so in 2014, we started to come up with a system for e-consent. And just by the way, I got started, but I have nothing to disclose. So we started working on a project to come up with the e-consent system in 2014. And when we started looking around, the only programs that we could find were programs that were really geared towards the outpatient setting. They had, they're great tools. They have embedded videos. They have tests that you can take to see how well the person who's giving consent understands it. But none of those platforms were very feasible in the acute stroke setting. So in 2015, the FDA published their draft guidelines, and so we used those to get started to come up with an e-consent platform. In 2016, HHS and FDA worked together to come up with a common guidance for electronic consent. When we started the process, we initially started it, and it just seemed futile. There was nothing available. The things that were available were very, very expensive. But once the FDA came out with their draft guidelines in 2015, we began working with our IT department, Emory IRB, REDCap, and our site coordinators. And we would basically come up with a system, and then we would sit and go through and figure out everything that was wrong with it. Basically, you have to work backwards. So we finally decided on using REDCap as a platform. We are able to use that. It's a survey that you can use as your e-consent. So again, one of the things that we all know is that getting consent in the presence of an acute stroke is very, very difficult, extremely difficult for a research study that requires written consent. After we started the e-consent, we've done it for 3 trials to date. Dr. Howson and our site have published 2 studies to date on using the e-consent platform. The most recent was just recently in 2019. We took the first 50 patients from the ESCAPE trial, and we did a survey to compare the patients that consented by e-consent and the ones that consented by paper consent. And so both of those papers are available. So I'm just going to focus today basically on how we went about setting up and implementing the e-consent process. Do I have an echo?
Okay, I just want to make sure.
Okay, so why did we use REDCap? We don't have any kind of proprietary interest in REDCap. We used it simply because it's very well priced. For our survey, we pay $25 a month per project, and so we're able to have 4 projects. That's how we're set up. You can set up different ways. We can have 4 projects going at any given time. It was available to us at Emory. It is HIPAA compliant. It provides an audit trail, and you're able to create processes to validate it and have it to be CFR Part 11 compliant. Again, one of the most important things about having an e-consent system, particularly in the setting of acute stroke, is it's got to be easy to navigate. So you get to think that who are your LARs? Well, if it's family members, if it's spouses, you're probably talking people like my dad's age. They're 80. They may have a cell phone. They're learning how to, use the computer pretty good, but in a situation where they're under a lot of stress, they could get very flustered trying to figure out a system that's difficult to navigate. Also, they're able to access the REDCap link from a computer, a laptop, a tablet, or a smartphone. And we're able to store the documents in the REDCap database until the study closes, and then you can archive everything into something that you can store on a disk. So an example of the one of the policies that we had to create in order to make our platform compliant was that because this is a static URL, that means that we can't lock it because all the patients are going to log into the same URL to fill out the consent. So the potential does exist for someone to be able to go back in after the fact and play with the data, either on purpose or by accident, because they can go back in and read the consent as many times as they want. So we made a policy that the very first consent form that was correctly filled out is considered the original consent form. So one of the things that I think I've discovered through my research, because now we're talking 3 years later that we've been using e-consent, and there's still not a commercially available platform for the acute setting that is able to be standardized across all centers. A lot of this is hospital policies differ, local and state laws differ. So each site has to make sure that whatever platform they're using they're able to make processes and rules that make it compliant with not only CFR 11, but with their hospital regulations and their state regulations. So just some basic stuff. An e-consent has to contain all of the elements of consent that your paper consent does. The responsibility to get consent before any study procedure still remains with the PI or his delegated staff, and you still have to get consent. You cannot delegate this authority to the machine itself. So the point that FDA is making is that you have to have some person who is responsible for the consent form, even in the electronic format. The research site's also responsible for making sure that you maintain the e-consent platform with the most recent version of the informed consent form that's approved by the IRB. So that comes back on the site to make sure that if you have an update or a change in date on your informed consent, that someone has to make sure to change that in the system. The information needs to be provided quickly, succinctly, as thoroughly as possible. And so in these situations, the interactive aids that you get in some of the other outpatient or non-acute settings are really not feasible in this setting. So in order to create a process that we had that was compliant with all of the regulations, we had to actually create a two-part system. So part one of the system is the actual informed consent that we send the link to the LAR to review the consent and to execute it. And then the second part is the attestation piece, because you need some way to document the consent process. So even though FDA doesn't technically require that whoever obtains consent signs the consent form, there does need to be documentation that clearly describes who did this consent discussion, what was discussed, that the LAR or patient were able to go and understand and get everything that they're required to be by the regulations. So this is the URL that we send. This is the one we actually had for one of our studies that's recently closed. So I want to just show you what it looks like when the patients actually open the URL. So if the first thing they see, again, this is a study recently, it gives instructions on how they need to fill out the form. Then they go, and the first thing they see will be a summary of the actual study. So it's a short paragraph summary. Then it's the actual consent form that the IRB approves. It's the paper consent form we upload into the system. So it's the exact same information that is approved for on paper that is for our e-consent. The patient then needs to, they don't have to enter their email address, but if they do, they get an immediate copy of a blank consent form. It is not encrypted, so we don't send a signed one to them until we get their permission to send one to them after the fact. In order to fill it out correctly, they have to put the name of the patient, they need to put their name and their relationship. One of the regulations is that if you're doing consent and you're not looking right there with the person, is you have to have some method of identifying who this person is and what their relationship is to the patient. In Georgia, we're very, very lenient laws on this. In some states, they want you to have ID or something to prove that this person is who they are. So you would have to write that into your policies to make it compliant. And then they just sign. You can sign with your finger on a tablet or a smartphone, or with a mouse on a computer. And as soon as they hit save signature, it logs the date and time that they have consented. As soon as they hit submit in the REDCap system, as you can see, it generates the survey is there, and then it pops up with an attestation piece. Whoever is the person obtaining consent has to go back in and complete the attestation piece as soon as possible after the patient's enrolled. Oh my God, and this is just what we see. And you can see the top, it has the date and time, so there is no question about when the consent was signed. And then this is the attestation piece continued, and these are the questions that you normally need to have documented for consent. So they're all here, and then they can put a comment if they want to. And then this is what we see when the attestation is complete, until it's complete, and then once it's complete, it'll be checked. And I just put these, we have a set policy that we submit with all of our studies, and it has our consent process for paper, for fax, and for REDCap, so that we are approved for all of them prior to starting the study, and then we can, decide if the study needs. And just a couple of pictures of Stone Mountain. Thank you very much.